Good evening and welcome to the September edition of the Highland Astronomical Society's monthly meeting. And a warm welcome too for any newcomers to the meeting, and I do hope you find something of interest here. At the moment all our club meetings are virtual, but we do hope to be getting back to see each other in the real world soon, and there'll be some more news about that later this evening. And so tonight, tonight we have John Rosenfield. John will be giving us a talk about the history of Chloe Stickney, who was married to the man who discovered the moons on Mars. Later, we will have Pauline Macrae, and Pauline will be talking about observing in general. This subject should be very timely now that the dark nights are back. In fact, after the meeting tonight, the forecast is for starry skies. So maybe a chance to practice what she preaches, so to speak. Pauline will bring us all the club news and astronomy photographs during her talk. As always, put your questions in the Q&A box and they'll be passed on for answering after the talks. Now, John Rosenfield has a lifelong interest in astronomy. He studied history and English literature at Nottingham University and did much research into the legend of Robin Hood. What else? He was admitted to the British Astronomical Association by the modern legend who was Heather Cooper. And he once shared a railway carriage with Patrick Moore. I'm so jealous. So let's sit back and listen to John take us back in time to the 1800s to tell the story of Chloe Angeline Stickney. Over to you, John.
Thank you very much, and thank you for coming tonight. I hope, can you hear me okay? Yeah?
Yeah.
Good. Last year, as you will all know, was messed about no end by COVID, and the BAA were no exception to that. First of all, they told us that they were coming up to have a meeting in Elgin, and so they will, so they might. But they also said that last year was a year to celebrate the role of female astronomers. And through the wonder of Zoom, I have attended talks on Alice Grace Cook at Fiametta Wilson and Wilhelmina Fleming, who was born in Dundee, for your information. But my contribution to that was to tell you about this American lady who lived through the American Civil War. Now, I never got a chance to do that last year. So the first thing I want to say tonight is that I offer grateful thanks on behalf of myself and the BAA for offering me the chance to tell her story tonight. It's a wonderful story and I hope you enjoy it. So, Chloe Angeline Stickney, born on All Saints' Day, so we are told, in 1830. Now, if we are to present her to a group of astronomers, then it must surely be, at least in part, because she married a famous astronomer. She married Asaph Hall, the man who discovered the Martian moons. And so she ended her days as Angeline Hall. But that is not to say that in any way she lived in the shadow of her famous husband. Rather, to her contemporaries, they regarded her in her own right as a mathematician, a teacher of mathematics and languages, and they honored her. This is the Martian moon Phobos. The large crater, which occupies a third of its surface, is called Stickney. It's quite simply named after Angeline. So the question that you might reasonably ask me is, how do we know anything at all about females who lived in the 19th century? And it is primarily because her third son, they had 4 sons together, her third son, Angelo, wrote down everything that he could remember about his mother, everything he knew. He addressed it to his own daughter, Peggy, saying, "You ought to know about your famous grandmother." And this was eventually published by Nunn and Company in Baltimore in 1902. So this is the book written by her son. So we will begin if you are sitting comfortably. In the foreword to his book, Angelo writes that he hoped his book would, and I quote, "vindicate the higher education of women." Now, to explain that, I'll need to take you to one side. This is Maria Mitchell, 1818 to 89. She was America's first professional female astronomer. She discovered a comet, did Maria Mitchell, and I think you can still look it up as Miss Mitchell's comet. Anyway, she toured Europe, she came to Britain, and she got as far as Edinburgh and Glasgow, and she met the Herschels. But what's important here is what happened to Maria Mitchell when she went home to USA. She decided to organize her life around 2 important beliefs. The first one, she was anti-slavery. She refused to wear any clothes that were made from Southern cotton. And the second thing she did was to devote herself to women's suffrage. And she founded the Society for the Advancement of Women. And the first talk she ever gave to that society was called The Higher Education of Women. So now we know what Angelo was writing about. So the first chapter in the book is called Granddaughter of the Revolution. And so she was. Angeline's grandfather was a larger-than-life character who rejoiced in the name of Moses Stickney. Now, we shall spend a little time with Moses Stickney because he's worth it. Moses Stickney fought in George Washington's army, that is, against us, the blooming British. He not only fought in George Washington's army, but he earned himself a reputation as a marksman, a sharpshooter. And Angelo, in his book, tells us, "I have seen the long-barreled musket of fine workmanship, which he carried in the Revolution, and I have listened to tales of his marksmanship, which are still preserved today in the Vermont valleys." And went on to say, perhaps he carried his musket at Bunker Hill. There are 2 remarkable testimonies to Moses Stickney. This is the first of them. Isn't that a wonderful testimony? The second one was written by a member of the church who visited Moses Stickney 2 days after his 100th birthday. And this is what he wrote. He lives at the foot of the Grand Monadnock. He was 100 years old on 21st of November last. The old gent enjoys better health than most people younger than himself. His appetite is good, and he can relish and digest as hearty a meal as anyone. He has always been an early riser, and he tells me that he is now the first one up in the house. He attended the annual meeting and cast his vote this present year. He walks sometimes as many as 4 or 5 miles in a day and takes most of the care of his cattle, yokes his own oxen, and goes into the wood a lot with his team. During the past season, he's taken charge of his own planting and harvesting. He has mown half a dozen acres or so, some of it for the second time. Mr. Stickney's sight is growing dim, but he says that he can pick up potatoes if the sun shines on them, and he sees the white ones better than any other colour. His hearing is so good that it's not at all difficult to converse with him. His memory seems quite tenacious, and he entertains his visitors with almost any amount of stories about the Revolution and George Washington of long ago. He takes quite an interest of late in having his apple trees grafted, supposing that the grafted fruit will be a source of profit to him in the years to come. May he live to see the fruit of his labours. So please, would you remember old Moses Stickney? He's worth it. They had children, he and Mary, and what I'm going to tell you now sounds just like a story from the old Wild West. And that is because it is a story from the old Wild West. Among their children was a daughter called Mary. Now, Mary was courted by a young man called Daniel Gilman. And Daniel Gilman managed to get on the wrong side of Mary's father. He just could not get on with Moses Stickney at all, to the extent that Moses Stickney declared that if any more young men should come a-courting my daughter, damn 'em, I'll shoot 'em. Now, Daniel Gilman was aware of Moses Stickney's reputation with a musket. So Daniel Gilman simply took off. He disappeared. At which point, Theophilus Stickney, Mary's brother, he went looking for Daniel Gilman. Now, unfortunately, we do not know if he ever found him, if the gunfight at the OK Corral ever took place. But Theophilus Stickney's search for Daniel Gilman took him into the next valley along, called the Black Country, and to lands owned by another old-time settler, just like Moses Stickney. This one was Elisha Cook and his lands there. Now, Theophilus Stickney, having got there, quickly discovered two important things. One was that his skills as a carpenter could find him work and earn him money. The second thing he discovered was that Elisha Cook had a daughter called Electa. And Theophilus Stickney and Electa Cook got their act together, and they were married in 1816 on Washington's birthday, as the book tells us. Now, I knew some of you would not be aware of when Washington's birthday was, so I put that up to help you. It's on February the 22nd. So they were married and quickly had 4 daughters, the third one of which was Angeline. But now we come to the sad part of the story, because what Angelo wrote next was this: it would be agreeable for me to record that they lived happily ever after, but they did not. And he goes on to explain that the lands owned by Elisha Cook grew thousands of acres of grain. There were no railroads at the time to take it away. They could not export it. And so what they did instead was to make whiskey out of it. And that whiskey became as free-flowing and as cheap as water. And Theophilus Stickney succumbed to that temptation. And it is sad to record that he died among strangers in Rochester Hospital in 1842. So at this point, we can say that Angeline never knew her father. So it drew the sisters together, and Mum Electa were all drawn much closer together as a family and tried their best to get on in life without a father. They lived in the village of Rodman in Jefferson County, New York. A brief description of Rodman, where they lived, was this: a Congregational and a Methodist church, 7 stores, a grist mill, a tannery, 2 blacksmith shops, a wagon shop, a creamery, a neatly kept hotel, and 35 dwellings. Angeline was described as a very solemn little girl, happy at times, with a sort of saintly happiness, but never merry. Perhaps too many of the saints had watched over her nativity. She went to school at 3, and at 5 she was spinning flax. And as a little girl watching her mother cook, she wondered at the chemistry of cooking. At 9, she had read a church history through, and at 12, she was an excellent housekeeper. She excelled in grammar and arithmetic at school. She missed a healthy, vigorous childhood. When she was 8 years old, she broke her leg sledging. And she could never eat salt pork for the rest in any of her life. But he does say this: after the cold, dreary winters, 1 blade of green grass would make her happy. So this is Angeline growing up, and it shone out to everyone who knew that girl that she had a gift of understanding how numbers relate to each other. It's far beyond saying she was good at maths. She was able to understand the relationship between numbers and between that and the observed universe. And it stood out to everyone. We have details of 2 essays written by her at the age of 15. The sugar maple tree. Potash from it, mixed with sand, makes glass. Telescopes are made from this, by the help of which all the knowledge of the host of planetary worlds has been discovered. And the second, listen to this: slavery, or holding men in bondage, is one of the most unjust practices, but many of our greatest men are dealers in buying and selling slaves. This was Angeline. She grew very close, particular to her sister Ruth, out of the sisters, and in 1847 her cousin Harriet paid for 3 terms tuition at Rodman School, and so Angeline went to the local county school teaching maths and earned $1.25 every week. Her sister Charlotte and her husband Edwin came to Pleasant Valley to see her, and Angeline said they could stay with them while she was spinning wool. And then in winter 1848, she became very close to Ruth, and she started going to church and prayer meetings to sort out what she believed for her faith, for her life. But we also know at this time she became ill with headaches, a pain in the chest, and a cough. She described it as consumption. We know it now as TB. But anyway, so there we have Angeline happily growing up with her sisters and her mother, helping as best she could, teaching in a local county school. And for all we know, we might have left her there, teaching maths and being happy. But that never suited Angeline. This is the school which she taught at, the old school in Pleasant Valley. I think it is a museum now, but I can't find out. But that is the school that Angeline taught at. But then Angeline's life changed forever when she accepted an invitation to McGrawville Central College, New York. Now, this college, I will tell you later, had a short but spectacular history. But Angeline went there first in 1849, along with 90 students. She was given a maths class to teach, and in 1855, she graduated with an MA in Greek, German, and mathematical astronomy. Here we have one highly educated lady. The college was in trouble because of its constitution. Before Macrae College, two colleges had very, very cautiously opened their doors to African Americans. And one, way ahead of its time, had offered places to women. Now, Macrae College, its constitution written by, I've got his name written, Cyrus Pitt Grosvenor. He was a Baptist reverend. Their constitution quite simply said, it doesn't matter who you are, you can come and study here. Now, because of that, American society on the eve of the Civil War was simply not ready to accept that. And an amazing amount of vitriol and hatred was aimed at Macrae College. This is the New York Herald Tribune, a forerunner of the New York Times we know today. If things are suffered to go on at this rate, the whole region will become affected with abolitionism. The contagion of free speech will spread till the fugitive slave law will become a nullity and the Union will collapse. Now, this provoked a reaction in Angeline, and the best way I can describe it to you is to say that the spirit of her grandfather, of George Washington's army, spoke through her. This is what Angeline wrote back to the newspaper. Yes, let the Union be dissolved, rather than bow in submission to such a detestable, abominable, infamous law. Ours is called a glorious union. Then is a union of robbers and pirates a glorious union? For to rob a man of his liberty is the worst of robberies, the foulest of piracies. It is legislative bribery. Would such a dissolution harm the North? No, it would be but a separation from a parasite that is sapping our very life. Would it harm the South? No, let them stand alone and be abhorred of all nations. Would it harm the slaves? No, because such a dissolution would surely strike the death blow to slavery. And to her sister Ruth, you know that she wrote this. I am glad that I know that the world will frown upon me because I am a student of this unpopular institution, and I expect to get the name applied to all who come here, fanatic. I am glad because I love this institution. I love the spirit which welcomes all to its halls, those of every tongue and of every hue, which holds out the cup of knowledge in its crystal brightness for all to drink from. And so it went from one crisis to another, but that's a story for another day. In 1855, the 24-year-old Asaph Hall came to Macrae College, bringing with him an immense intellect in the theory of mathematics, which later allowed him to calculate the orbits of satellites round planets. He brought himself to notice by walking into the math room. In the math room on the blackboard, there had been written an equation, complicated equation, which for 2 terms, no one had been able to solve. Asaph Hall looked at the equation, sat down for a couple of minutes, and then wrote in the answer. He was put in Angeline's class, and so the story goes, so we are told, egged on by his friends, he tried to ask Angeline questions, which supposed she would not be able to answer, but she always answered them. The French couldn't understand about their getting together. She was a sincere Baptist. He was outside the pale of any religious sect. He disbelieved in women's suffrage, wasted little sympathy on slaves, and what was worst of all, he played cards. Can you imagine? So, Asaph Hall and Angeline, it really was a true meeting of minds between them, and they quickly began a romance. But the very first thing Angeline asked him was, did he have any problem with drink? And you can now understand why she asked that question from the bottom of her heart, never having known her father. He did not. So romance followed quickly. It really was a meeting of minds. They had 10 weeks together at the college. She then went to see her sister, Charlotte, in Wisconsin, and he went home to Goshen, Connecticut. They exchanged letters saying they were missing each other, and at first they looked out for a school where they both might teach. And while this was happening, it's worth pointing out that Angeline's mum, Electa, married again. She married to Milton Woodward, and they are buried in the local cemetery today. Asaph wrote to her, and after his graduation, he went to Rodman to see her, and he bought an engagement ring. In spite of her puritanical protests against such adornment as this, she wore it faithfully all of her life. They were married, let me find it. Yes, they were married at Elkhorn, Wisconsin on March the 31st, 1856, and they started, sorry, here I am showing Asaph Hall in his smart suit. It's not what his sisters said about him later, but anyway. So they were married and they went to Ann Arbor in Michigan. This is a holiday area to this day, a ski resort in the winter and cherry apple blossom in the summer and the fall. And so they did look for a school where they could teach together, but Mr. Hall, Asaph Hall, must have decided to be an astronomer. Angeline wrote this. Mr. Hall and I went to Elder Bright's and stayed over Sunday, and we were married on Monday morning and started for Ann Arbor in the afternoon. So the breakthrough for Asaph Hall was when he was asked to go and be an assistant at the US Naval Observatory in Washington. Now, this was under the tutelage of a famous man of his time, William Cranch Bond. And Asaph worked under him, and there was no doubt in Asaph's mind that he learnt much from him. But he was paid and working as an assistant under William Cranch Bond. Meanwhile, Angeline had gone to Goshen, Connecticut to meet his family and wrote this. He is real good and we are very happy. He's a real true noble man, besides being an extra scholar. So you must never be concerned about my not being happy with him. He will take just the best care of me that he possibly can. And later, when Asaph himself got sick with a fever, she wrapped him in wet, warm blankets. And so, as the book says, they cherished each other in sickness and in health. Now, in 1859, William Cranch Bond died, and Asaph found himself on $400 pay in sole charge of the US Naval Observatory in Washington. At this time also, Asaph's sisters came to stay with them, And you can imagine the scene, can't you? The sisters putting their arms around Angeline, taking her for a walk and saying, can you not do something about how scruffy he looks in that old overcoat? Can you not smarten him up a bit? So, right. The first two children, little Asa and Samuel, were born before the Civil War started. And Angeline wrote that the children are keeping May Day like the old English fashion. It's a beautiful day, the warmest we've had this spring. Mr. Hall and I have been maying. We got some dandelions and some blossom of the soft maple. So, Asa now in charge of the US Naval Observatory in Washington. We move on. This is it in its spring blossom. It's nice. The next story I have to tell you is that the American Civil War began, and from Washington, you could hear the sounds of gunfire very clearly from the city of the Second Battle of Bull Run. There was an exchange of letters, an anxious exchange of letters between Angeline and Asa. Dearest Asa, I wish I could go right on to you. I feel so troubled about you. Will you write me as soon as you get this and tell me whether to come now or not? If there is a danger, I'd rather share it with you. Little Asaph says he does not want his papa to get shot. Asaph wrote back nothing if not reassuring. Please do not worry. I shall keep along my business. We're observing the planet Mars. I work every other night. Do not tell little A that I'm going to be shot. Don't expect anything of that kind. That, despite Asaph knowing that his roommate and two of his stepbrothers had been wounded at that battle of Second Bull Run. Now, as the war went on, it came even closer to Angeline in particular. I don't know how much you know about the American Civil War, Gettysburg and Abraham Lincoln and all that, but I bet you won't have heard of Jubal Early. He was a Confederate commander. Born in Virginia, he fought at Gettysburg under Stonewall Jackson and grew to be in command of a corps of about 1,800 men. Now, it was one of the happenstances of war, just something that happens. Jubal Early's corps found itself about 60 miles south of Washington. He sent out scouts and discovered that nothing lay between him and the city. At the same time, the US General Sheridan realized the same thing and scrambled to get together Union troops to throw in the way to stop him. But Jubal Early advanced close enough to Washington to cause a panic in the city. Now, there are two things you don't know yet. Firstly, while this was happening, Angeline was working with a group of people who were helping escaped slaves. They were helping to find food and warmth and shelter for the escaped slaves. Jubal Early, after his defeat, he dressed as a farmer, which I'm showing him now on the right, and he escaped to Mexico. And from Mexico, we know that he wrote 4, perhaps 5 or 6 pamphlets on the subject of white supremacy. We will not go any further into that subject. I simply want to make the point to you how great was the danger which came so close to Angeline on that afternoon in Washington. Anyway, they lived to see Sherman bring the Army of the Potomac in a victory celebration, And somewhere in that crowd, I promise you, are Asaph Hall and his wife, Angeline, but I don't know where. But this was a celebration. And so they settled down again. Now, the next part of the story will move on quickly. Right. Mars came to opposition on the September the 5th, 1877. It was in the constellation of Aquarius, and it was 35 million miles distant. Now, much of the technology in the world's telescopes had developed since the last opposition, and so they began to search the skies, looking for Mars, and searching the skies, they did not know what they were looking for. The very pleasant thing to tell you about this, by the way, is in all this looking at Mars at opposition, nobody mentioned canals, nobody mentioned towpaths, nobody mentioned warlike Martians. What a blessed and happy time it was. However, Asaph, in charge of the US Naval Observatory, privately told Angeline that he felt discouraged by the failure of what he described as more experienced and more skillful astronomers than himself to find any evidence for any moons that might be revolving around Mars. But he wrote in his diary, "I was saved by the encouragement of my wife. Each night, she sent her husband to the observatory, supplied with a nourishing lunch. Each night, she awaited developments with eager interest. There was a great secret in the house, and all members of the family were drawn together more closely by a mutual confidence." So we know now that William Cooper Key also observed Deimos, but he did not find Phobos. Now we have a transcript here of Asaph's notes, and they have been described because he did not call them Deimos and Phobos. They hadn't been named then. He described them as satellite 1 and 2. But this is what he wrote. Mars at 35 million miles, Deimos at 80 degrees, and fast-moving Phobos at 50 degrees. Both are tidally locked. Phobos rises in the west, sets in the east twice a day. Deimos rises in the east, sets in the west. And he wrote something which may still be of interest today to those of us who like to study the planets and their satellites. He wrote this: "The strings of craters suggest to me that Phobos may not be the first body to spiral inwards towards Mars." I'll let you think of that. So he, to some extent, frustrated Angeline and his friends by waiting another 4 days, because as he explained later, how did I know that there were only going to be 2? So he continued searching, but eventually he became known to the world as the discoverer of the Martian moons. Now, here we have the two of them together. Asaph tours the States, he toured Europe. The French in particular made a fuss of him. The Lalande Prize, the gold medal of the Royal Astronomical Society, the Arago Medal, and later they awarded him the Légion d'honneur. And this is the medal that they struck for him in 1879. Angeline, on the other hand, you can describe her as a modern housewife now. She's looking after the kids. And there they are. But does this mean that they led separate lives? By no means, because the first thing they did was buy a house in Washington in North Street, which was going to be their family home for the rest of their lives. We have a description of it. 3 stories with a flat tin roof and 3 bay windows. A furnace, a large kitchen range, 2 open fire gates, an old-fashioned German looking glass with a carved frame, a framed winter scene painted by one of the family, A fern rose in one of the bay windows. Over the fireplace, a picture of Lincoln. A round mahogany table on which Asaph used to teach the boys how to play whist. Angeline sat in a low cane-seated rocking chair of oak, sewing. In childhood, she loved wildflowers. In Georgetown, she sought out her old friends again and brought them home to take root in her yard, supplied with rich woods earth from the stump of an old tree. They grew sweet corn for their table. In the front yard, a large blackheart cherry tree, crabapple, damson, plum, and peach, a box hedge and evergreens, walks bordered by flower beds. In the backyard, a large English walnut tree, and the little halls used to shoot at nuts on that tree with bows and arrows. Angeline was in charge of the hotbeds, 7 long sashes. Dear, I've had too much to drink already. Sashes under which violets bloomed, and she grew rose bushes, one for each of her sons, one for Asa, and one for her mother. So, while they're there, Angeline remains at home with the child, and Asa, of course, was often away. But we have this wonderful description, which I need to read to you. Pork and lard she banished from her kitchen. Beef suet is much cleaner. Chief article of diet was meat. She was no vegetarian, and the Georgetown markets provided the best of Virginia beef and mutton. When Asaph came home, but not to Washington, she wrote this to him. Dearest Asaph, I've just got through the morning's work. Got up at 5:30, built the fire, got the breakfast, cold roast beef, baked potatoes, Graham's gems, raspberries and cream. Percy got up with me and went for the berries. Angelo went over to Uncle Hyman's for milk and cream, and Samuel played in the garden. Breakfast was at 7:30, and she finished by saying, I have mastered the situation here. I'm sure Asaph agreed with that. Graham's gems, just in case you don't know, she referred to it. Sylvester Graham in the 1850s was saying to people, don't buy nasty white bread, make your own sourdough. I don't know if you've heard that before. There is nothing new under the sun. And for a short while, he had his own sourdough bakery. So when Angelo says she has Graham gems, she's talking about American muffins, which are sourdough. Okay. And this is a museum. It's not a picture inside the house in North Street, but it looks quite astonishingly like it. Okay. Now, this is typical between husband and wife. Asaph became interested. He met with Dr. Franz Brunel, very much at the forefront of astronomical science of his day. And Asaph was interested in his works. Now, Angeline did not read the German out to him. She sat down and taught her husband enough German so that he could read Dr. Franz Brunel's work for himself. So when they were together, when Asaph and Angeline were together, they traveled to Colorado. There was a total eclipse in 1878. This is the only picture I could find of it. Angeline was not above wearing the bloomer dress. In fact, she wore it at Macrae College. This bloomer dress immediately identified her as a suffragist, and she was proud to wear it. While Asaph was touring the States, the Boston ladies, at the forefront of fashion then as now, invited her to wear that dress at one of their meetings about women's suffrage. And we know that Asaph said to her, "We are trying to make our way in society here. You are not going out in that dress." Now, all the married people who are listening tonight will know very well the outcome of that exchange of views. And Angeline went wearing the bloomer dress. Anyway, when Asaph was not with them, we can portray Angeline as a modern housewife, and she took the kids camping, except she had rather spectacular places where she took her boys. These are some of the holiday resorts in the Adirondacks. These are some of the places at Lake Placid, the Mohawk Valley, Saranac Lake, and Mount Hurricane. Joined the Ladies Historical Society of Washington. Incidentally, 2 weeks ago, I looked them up, and they are all about celebrating 100 years of women's suffrage. So well done, Angeline. And she managed to contact Grandad Cook's first cousin, who was 100 years old, but who told her that he could remember skating with old Elisha Cook. So we have moved on now. Remember the little girl who at the end of winter, one blade of green grass would make her happy. Now she is thanking her sister Mary for the tub of apples that she sent them and the cider from which she made apple pie. And she made also applesauce, which she thought was splendid because they'd not had any since they came to Washington. Okay, so coming towards the end, the last reunion of the sisters was in the summer of 1891. And how good it was to see the sisters all in one wagon. And the last reunion of the whole family was at Christmas of 1891. Angeline shared Christmas with them for the last time. Angeline lived to see all 4 of her sons graduate from Harvard. So it was a true meeting of mathematical minds. That was one of the satisfactions of her life. And so on the 3rd of July, 1892, Angeline Hall died in peace. Just before we end, maybe for discussion at the after meeting, I just want to throw this at you. This is something she wrote at the height of her powers. See what you think about this. In thinking of Galileo and the office of the telescope, which is to give us an increase of light, and of the increasing power of the larger and larger lenses, which widens our horizon to infinity, this constant recurring thought comes to me. How shall we grow into the immensity that is opening up before us? The principle of light pervades all space. It travels from star to star and makes known to us all objects on earth and in heaven. The great ether throbs and thrills with its burden to the remotest star as a joy. But there is also an all-pervading force, so subtle that we know not yet how it passes through the illimitable space. But before it, all worlds fall into divine order and harmony. It is gravitation. It imparts the power of one to all and gathers from all for the one. What in the soul answers to these 2 principles is, first also light or knowledge by which all things are unveiled, the other which answers to gravitation and before which all shall come into proper relations and into the heavenly harmony, and by which we shall fill the heavens with our souls and our souls with heaven. I will finish in the same way that Angelo finished his book. So I hope you will remember Angeline with the respect that she surely deserves.
Thank you, John. That was a wonderful insight into a remarkable lady. It's at the moment we don't have any questions for you because you clearly have answered every question in such a detailed talk. It's fascinating to see how quite often the name of a great astronomer and great things that happen in astronomy are passed off with no background to them. You know, you think of great names, but who were they and what did they do? And they seem to live the lives that we live, just ordinary lives full of problems. And yet there they are discovering moons of Mars and who knows what. I have to thank you again, John. That was splendid.
Thank you. Thank you.
You're welcome. You're welcome. I'm moving on now to Pauline Macrae. She is going to bring us the news from the club activities and the photographs that we've been able to produce in the last month. So Pauline, let's hear what you've got to say.
Thank you very much, Dave. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Good. Okay. Well, good evening, everyone. I'm sure you'll all have noticed how quickly the nights are now drawing in, and with the darker evenings, our thoughts turn to observing. So I'm going to talk to you about what sorts of things you can see in the night sky. And within the talk, I'll be including club news, sky stuff, and your photographs, new ones, as well as some from, well, last couple of years and more. And this is to illustrate the things that I'm saying. Perhaps the biggest misconception about observing is that you need a telescope. But there are lots of things to see with just your eyes, which can then be enhanced by binoculars. However, if you do have access to a telescope, then the invisible is revealed, allowing us to see the life cycle of stars and galaxies that are millions of light years distant. All this playing out just above your head. Let's have a look first at how the changing position of the sun gives us longer nights. After the summer solstice, the sun appears to get lower in the sky, and sunset, which gets earlier with each passing day, moves from north of west at the summer solstice towards due west, which it will reach at the autumnal equinox. And the closer we get to the equinox, the faster the sun seems to move along the horizon. Now, sunset at the equinox along my horizon is off the screen. So if you notice how long it takes or the distance the sun travels in 2 months up until the end of August, and then the distance that the sun will again travel in just less than 1 month, you can see how much faster it's going. And watching the changing position of the sun is something that you can do very easily without any equipment. We reached true or astronomical darkness in the middle of August, and although it only lasted about 3/4 of an hour, by the time we reached tonight, the 7th of September, it has extended to 5.5 hours, beginning at 10:30 in the evening. And it continues to start earlier and last longer as the weeks go by until we reach the winter solstice. Astronomical darkness allows us to see the faintest of objects. And although at this time of year, we have to wait up until darkness descends, this is actually really useful for learning or reminding yourself how to set up and use your equipment, whether it's a planisphere, binoculars, telescope, or camera, as well as planning what you are going to observe. And that's where a planisphere or a sky map plus books are really useful. So I'm going to point out a few things. Here we have the summer triangle. There's Cassiopeia. Here's the plough. This is Capella rising in the northeast, the 6th brightest star in the sky. And here is Arcturus, which is setting in the west. That's the 4th brightest star in the sky. So the other advantage of September and October is that the evenings tend to be milder and much more pleasant. This was our first observing session of the season 2 years ago. It had been an absolutely beautiful day, which then drifted into a sparklingly clear night. And at 9 o'clock, it was still incredibly mild. However, mild or not, it's very important to make sure you wear warm clothes or at least take them with you. Use hand warmers if you've got them. If you don't, then a hot drink to cuddle works very well. And of course, it'll warm you from the inside out. If you're hungry, you'll feel colder, so take something to eat. I would always recommend chocolate. A mobile phone for your safety, but mobiles now have apps on them which actually show you what constellations are in the night sky. And they have cameras. Sometimes it's possible to photograph objects as long as they're bright enough through the eyepiece of a telescope. If you can, take other people with you for your safety. If not, then at least let them know where you're going to be. A red light won't destroy your night vision, and you can use it to look at a sky map or planisphere. If you want to look up at the sky in order to look at the Milky Way, or even to use binoculars so that you can examine the Milky Way, then a deck chair is ideal just for lying back. Otherwise, you end up with a really sore neck the following day. And if you're going to be sitting for any length of time at the eyepiece of a telescope or a camera, then a stool is also very useful. Now, as the sun sets and darkness falls, it's also a good time to reacquaint yourselves with some of the brighter stars, as they are the first to appear, such as those making up the summer triangle. Although Altair and Deneb are only the 12th and 19th brightest stars, they're easy to see because they are found straight up in the darkest part of the sky. You may well have already noticed Capella, which I pointed out, rising in the northeast, and Arcturus, another one I pointed out, low down in the western sky. And gradually you'll begin to make out some of the brighter, familiar constellations, such as the Plough. And here we've got the Plough. Follow the tail down and you'll come to Arcturus, as long as it's not too late in the evening, by which time Arcturus will have set. And of course, you can also use the pointer stars to point towards Polaris, our North Pole star. And that tells you where north is. And of course, you see the aurora in the northern sky. Now, the Plough as well as the summer triangle are both asterisms, not really constellations, because they are part of a larger constellation. And here is Cassiopeia, which looks like a W or an M, depending on the time of night and time of year. So a W in the springtime, and in the autumn, it looks a bit like an M standing on its side. And this is where a sky map, planisphere, or an app on your phone is really useful to identify some of these constellations. There is nothing quite so beautiful as a clear sky growing darker, seeing the first stars appear and listening to the quietness that dusk seems to bring. And yes, the sound of silence is beautiful. And here we have a little constellation. This is called Delphinus, the leaping dolphin. And here are the 3 stars that you look for when you're looking for Aquila, the eagle. That's Altair in the middle. And there are the eagle's outstretched wings and his tail. Always look out for the aurora. often seen more frequently around the time of the equinoxes. And the autumnal equinox this year is on the 22nd of this month. Lisa may well have been the first to see the aurora this season, and certainly the first to photograph, and you can see some colour through the clouds here. Now this is Eric's all-sky camera, and you can see the auroral arc in the northern part of the sky. And here is a very definite ray. Now on the same night, Lisa took this photograph. There's the auroral arc, or Valhalla's bridge, as I like to call it, and some rays which become more distinctive and of this gorgeous purple color in this photograph. And then we have a photograph by a friend of Dave's, and he has taken a wonderful picture of the aurora, again with the auroral arc, and again those purple spires. And now something else that is easily seen with your eyes is that most familiar of objects, the moon, whether it's full or just a crescent showing earthshine. If you look for the moon at moonrise, it's occasionally bathed in this glorious red color. And if you get out your binoculars, the detail of the craters becomes apparent, with the dark Macrae and lighter highland areas also easily seen. However, when viewing the moon through a telescope, it can take your breath away, with the craters falling into sharp relief, standing proud on the terminator, which is the edge of the moon. You'll also end up blind in one eye because the moon's light is incredibly intense, but don't worry because your other eye will still be dark adapted. And if you have access to a telescope, you can sketch the craters as Dave has done here. Often heralding bad weather, a halo can appear around the moon due to ice crystals in cirrus cloud refracting the light. And that's the same reason why you get a sun halo. Or when there are showers at night and a full or near full moon, you might glimpse an ethereal moonbow. And just as with a rainbow, make sure the moon is behind you and you are looking through the rain. Then there are the planets, the locations of which can be found in astronomy magazines and the internet. They are generally easy naked eye objects, although Mercury can be rather elusive, and it's too close to the horizon for us to see it this month. And Venus is still very low down on the southwestern horizon, so it remains tricky to see. Mars is no longer visible and won't be back with us until virtually the end of the year, but Jupiter shines brightly. And Saturn, not in this particular photograph, is also visible, fairly low down in the southern sky. Now it's possible to see the Galilean moons from a dark sky site using binoculars. If you get a run of clear nights, you'll be able to see how quickly they change position. Don't panic if one or two of them seem to disappear. And that's simply because they could be hidden behind Jupiter or maybe in front of it. Now, this is my image of Jupiter, and you can, with a little bit of imagination, just about make out one of the bands near the top. But this photograph by Dave shows the belts and zones very clearly. This image of Saturn is one I took with my mobile phone through the eyepiece of our big telescope. So even if you have no equipment but your phone, with the brighter objects, you can do the same thing. But I am particularly pleased with this image that I took with my DSLR camera through my 80mm refractor. I had always assumed that in order to take any pictures at night, you had to have long exposures, apart from the moon, of course. But Dave said, no, the planets are considered bright. Therefore, you have to reduce your exposure time. So that's what I did. And gradually my blurred image of Saturn became sharper. Now I've still got a long way to go, but with Dave and Eric's help, I'm quite sure I'll get there. And it's the same for yourselves. If you want extra tuition when it comes to astrophotography, then they are the ones to go to. Now look how Jupiter and Saturn have changed over the last year. So this brighter one is Jupiter. And that was in August last year. Now, Paul took this photograph of the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction in December of last year. And now look at where Jupiter is. It's over on the left-hand side. This photograph has probably been magnified a bit because Jupiter and Saturn aren't quite as far apart as you see them here. But it just shows how quickly Jupiter has overtaken Saturn and is now on the left-hand side, leaving Saturn far behind. It's not really surprising when you consider that Jupiter is closer to the Sun than Saturn is, and Jupiter takes 12 years to orbit the Sun, whereas Saturn takes 29.5 years. It's even possible to see Uranus from a dark sky site. Now, Uranus has a magnitude of about 5.7 at the moment. So it is at the limits of naked eye visibility. But if you go to look for it in a dark sky site, you end up with so many stars that it's actually really difficult to work out which star is Uranus. So this is where having another planet or something else close by enables you to work out which of those stars is Uranus. As you continue to adapt to the dark, preferably without the moon or light pollution, you'll notice a lot more stars. And you might also see meteors, shooting stars, tiny grains of dust burning up in the atmosphere, leaving bright trails of glowing white hot air behind them. Now, the images of the meteors that I'm showing you are most likely all Perseids. We don't know for certain. And Eric's all-sky camera picked up quite a few, but I'm not showing them all, you'd be glad to hear. The bright blob in the left-hand side is Jupiter. This was a particularly bright meteor, with what we would call a fireball or a boloid. And this one, well, we think it's a meteor. It's got this bright beginning part with the fainter trail behind it. There were certainly no satellites around at that time. Must have been bright because it's dawn, it's light. And maybe it was a meteor. Could be a bit of debris breaking up. Perhaps we'll never know. Our first session up at the observatory was to watch the Perseid meteor shower. We were lucky in that there were large patches of clear sky showing the Milky Way here. Unfortunately, none of us managed to capture any of the meteors with the camera, but we saw perhaps a dozen between us in the couple of hours that we were there, but a little bit disappointed that there weren't any more. It seems, however, there was an outburst the following night, and it was cloudy here. Following the successful session up at the observatory, we intend holding a star party. And this will take place this Friday, the 10th of September at 8 o'clock. And I know 8 o'clock means it'll still be light, but that's fine because remember, it's a good time to set up your equipment in the light. Now, if it's overcast or raining, then we'll make it the Saturday night. If both nights aren't suitable, we'll have to cancel. But we do hope to have ad hoc sessions and we'll contact you by email or through the Nebulous news group when we plan to hold them. We won't be advertising these sessions on the website or Facebook. And this is because at the moment, the observatory is not open to the public. We're going to keep it for members only to make it as safe as possible while COVID is still around. And because of that, we need you to bring your own food and drink. The kitchen will be out of bounds, but don't worry if you see some of us going in and out of the main room because we're supervisors and we need to get bits and pieces. The toilet will be available. Also, could you please bring your own equipment? And that means binoculars, maybe a telescope or camera if you have them, because we won't be sharing out equipment at the moment. However, we will put the big telescope onto the giant planets, Jupiter and Saturn, and quite possibly you'll be able to take a photograph through the eyepiece, because the theme is going to be the mighty planets, Jupiter and Saturn. And there will be demonstrations of astrophotography, astrosketching, and polar aligning. Now, while we're on the subject of the observatory, just to let you know that the rotten step has been mended, but all the steps will need to be replaced at some point. We hope to do this next year. So if there are any joiners out there, or if you can recommend any joiners, then please let me know, because we're going to have to replace the steps all together, sort of in a oneer if you like. But they are safe at the moment, so you're not going to fall down any holes or anything. And I'm also going to talk about the auction of Arthur's special books in this section, and you'll see why in a moment. So once again, thank you to everyone who took part, and for the donations that you gave. We've raised £85.25. So Arthur would be really pleased. The Astronomy Photography of the Yearbook was bought by Gail, and she has donated it to the club. So it'll be available to anyone who would like to borrow it. So this is a really big thank you to Gail at this point. And you'll get a chance to look at it or take it away with you at the star party. Now, while you're looking for meteors, you'll probably see a number of satellites which can be observed as steadily moving points of light as they cross the sky, leaving behind these long trails in photographs. A bright satellite is the International Space Station, easy to see when it's around, either early morning, where it is at the moment, or in the evening, where it will be from about the 18th of this month. It's very bright and usually low down on the horizon. So if you watch the trail again, there it goes. Although, of course, when we're looking at it in the sky, we don't see a trail. That's because this is a video. We will just see a very bright moving point of light. Now, apparently, you can see the Chinese space station. I've not seen it myself yet. And that should be the top line. The bottom dotted line is apparently the rocket body. And the reason it's dashed is because you are seeing it intermittently, in just the same way as some satellites tumble. And as they tumble, they catch the sunlight while they rotate. What we don't want to see are Elon Musk's Starlink satellites, which you can see going across Dave's wonderful picture here. They look like this after they set off and they have been photographed all together, but utterly ruin long exposure photographs. Fortunately, they don't seem to be too bad up here, but are worse further south. Now, to view any of these various satellites, a really good website to use is heavensabove.com. As long as you put in your correct latitude and longitude, then you'll get an accurate timing of the satellite. If you're lucky, your town or city will be in its database. There is no point in putting in Inverness if you live just outside Inverness, because you might end up by missing a satellite just by a few minutes. It's very dependent on your accurate position. So what you want to look for really is the ISS. There's the Chinese space station. And we've got daily predictions for brighter satellites, but there are plenty of other things that you could explore. What you do is to click on this and you'll find that you get information about the brightness, the altitude, and the time that the ISS is going over. If you click on anything that's highlighted there, then it'll produce a constellation map to show you exactly which constellation and whereabouts it is as it passes across. What else can we see? Well, there are star clusters like the Pleiades, which is the obvious one, and it can be observed, of course, without visible aid. Now, at this time of year, we have to wait until the late evening before we see it, and it'll be appearing in the eastern sky. To me, the Pleiades indicate Orion, and that means that once we see Orion, then we know that winter is coming, but it is one of the best constellations to view. Other star clusters tend to be better seen with binoculars. However, there are some, and that includes at least 2 of the star clusters in Auriga, that you can just see with the naked eye as long as it's dark enough. Now, if you use books or a sky map, work out where they are, you can then use binoculars to find them, and they will look better with a bit of magnification. It takes a little while to get used to using binoculars to find things like this, but once you get used to doing it, then it becomes quite easily. There's another star cluster, that's M35 in Gemini. And while you've got binoculars in hand, how about some double stars? Well, one of the easiest, which is also naked eye visibility, is the double star in the Plough, Alcor and Miser. Used to be a test of eyesight. It's now more of a test of how light polluted your skies are. And the Hyades is also a star cluster. And just like the Pleiades, they're found in the constellation of Taurus. But if you use binoculars and look for this one here, you've got 2 contrasting colors. Not easy to see colors in binoculars, much better with a small telescope. But there are certainly a few double stars that are worth looking for with binoculars. Now, decent comets may appear, or very rarely appear, but when they do, they are worth looking out for, although they usually require binoculars or a telescope. There is apparently a big one on its way, but it's not going to get here for a few years yet, and it may well have fizzled out by that time. And some comets are totally unexpected. This one appeared in 2007, photographed by Eric here. And it's actually an asteroid that may have been hit and cracked open, allowing gases to escape. It brightened 1,000,000-fold overnight and was very easy to find in binoculars. Reminded us of how spectacular our galaxy looks, even when there are only patches of clear sky available. Now is the time to search for fainter objects like the Andromeda Galaxy. Find the great square of Pegasus, move 2 bright stars along and 2 bright stars, or 2 fainter stars up, and the Andromeda Galaxy is right by this second star. With the naked eye, it'll look rather like a fuzzy patch. And yes, I know this is an awful photograph of mine, but it shows the Andromeda Galaxy. And this is roughly what you will see with the naked eye. Although really, in order to see these faint objects, you need to use averted vision. We don't use our central vision at night. And instead, we have to bring our light sensitive rods into play, which is why we look very slightly to the side. The Andromeda Galaxy looks better through binoculars, and better still through a small telescope. But it's really a camera that brings out the detail of the spiral arms. And this particular photograph of the Andromeda Galaxy was taken just a month ago by Mark from Stornoway Astronomy Society. And you've got the wonderful dust lanes within it, as well as the two satellite galaxies M32 and M110. Now, amateur astronomers will also always suggest that you learn the night sky as best you can, and then use binoculars to explore it. Unfortunately, so many people buy a telescope expecting to see Hubble-like images as soon as they point it at the sky, and that won't happen. If you don't know the sky, you won't know what to look at or where to point the telescope. And you have to be realistic about what you see. Your eyes are the limiting factor when you look through a telescope. They can't build up a picture like a camera does. For example, the Ring Nebula does look like this, but without the color, because we don't see color at night. So it looks a kind of a grayish ring. Unless, of course, it is a bright object like the double star in Cygnus called Albireo. And then you very definitely see two contrasting colors, a golden yellowy color of one star and a bluey green of the other. And different people will see very slightly different shades of these colors. Now, even with a go-to telescope, you still need to know what you are looking for. You need, for example, the database name and also whether the constellation is visible. So Lyra and Cygnus are there in the autumn, but we don't see them in the winter. So that would be pointless looking for these two particular objects at that time. Our 14-inch telescope can show numerous deep sky objects, although it's definitely not Hubble, and they can look amazing, but many also appear small and faint. However, when you realize that these objects are thousands to millions of light years away, the light from which has taken that same amount of time to reach your eyes, then suddenly being able to see these faint fuzzies gives you a profound feeling of awe and wonder. A telescope can certainly open up a whole new picture of our night sky. But if you are able to use a camera with that telescope, then it becomes possible to discover the gorgeous gems that are imperceptible to the naked eye in astonishing detail and color. And this is an absolutely stunning photograph, again by Mark from Stornoway, of the Elephant's Trunk Nebula that you can find in Cepheus. Of course, you never know what you might discover. The last slide is of a new deep sky object photographed by Eric's all-sky camera and named by Anthony as the Cat's Head Nebula. Thank you, everyone.
Pauline, of course, the most inspiring talk. Just makes you want to get straight out the front door and do it all for real. Thank you so much. Wonderful pictures as usual. I'm really charmed by your picture of Saturn, which really came out really well.
It did, yes. I was so pleased with it. So thank you very much.
Oh, you most well. That was a magical night, and I'm really looking forward to seeing more of our friends up at the observatory for the dark skies.
Dave, can I just say thank you to you for stepping in to Eric's shoes as chairman tonight. And also a huge thanks to Lisa, who is behind the scenes, who's ended up by having to run the webinar single-handed. We are really grateful to her, and she's done a splendid job.
She has indeed.
And I think at this point, we also ought to make an appeal to the membership for committee members, because we are getting to the point where we're pretty desperate now. I have agreed to become secretary, so you don't have to worry about being secretary, but we could really do with a couple of committee members. So if you feel that you could join us and we don't bite, we're good fun, then we would love to have you. Okay, thanks, Steve.
Fantastic. Well, I would just echo what Pauline said there. If you can help, let's get together, get our heads together. John, thank you once again for your wonderful talk, and we hope to see you in the near future too. Could you just close your camera for us, please? Thanks, John. So it just leaves now to wind up this meeting for September, and wish you all clear skies and dark nights, and hope to see you Friday or Saturday. Good night.